Oh, I'm so tired. Took a bath. I was like gonna blow dry my hair before I came on here, but I'm like make myself look really ugly. I was like, should we cover this? I know I said we were going to, but I'm super tired. Are people even still talking about it? Hold on. We are public. Okay. There it is. I am looking like a nematode, okay? If you make fun of what I look like right now, you're dead to me. Okay, I remember everything. I make them fall in love with a full face of makeup, and then I'm back. Hi. And I have, like, eyelash glue still stuck on. I was like, let me put on some mascara." I clumped even worse. I no hair. Perfect. Where is this chat? You said it, not me. I know. A nematode. I'm looking like Kamala and fucking Trump in the campaign where they face off in, like, Turkey. So, I looked a little bit at the comments, and I guess people agree with our assertion that Donald Trump was winning. I don't know, I thought Kamala, like, did well in terms of, like, um, you know, a woman that's so misogynistic, but it's like you got this guy that's, like, known for just being crazy on those debates. It probably was nerve-wracking in some extent. Oy. Don't ever you're a lady, don't ever tattoo your eyebrows. You could, like, look cute for a year and then sad. I look insane. Um, I wasn't using Tret for, like, a few days, tretinoin, actually for, like, a good month, which was crazy because I used it every day for probably a year, but I just started using it the past 2 days again, and man, if you're, like, scared of aging, go see a dermatologist or go on Amazon and get a prescription to tretinoin. I wish I would've been on it when I was younger. Spray tan. You know, it's doing nothing for the hands, though. Maybe I haven't really been I wash my hands a lot. But when you bartend, oh my god, I destroyed my hands. I never put sunscreen on my hands, and if I did, it rubbed off. They're coming to eat not the dogs, or they're eating the dogs. I sound like Jennifer Coolidge. They're eating the dogs. Oh, this is way more than you're supposed to put on. It's I think I like the consistency of the gel better, though. I've been, like, out of this. This is the cream, this is the strongest grade, and it's, like, strong. It was when I first used it. You have to keep using it, though. The debate. It was, like, the first time I think I've sat down, at least filmed a video reviewing presidential debate live. They tend to be I don't know. The older I get, the more into politics I am, but, like, I don't know, did you guys find it to be a lot? I was like, "Damn, that's kind of a lot." And, like, they're both lying and stuff, or, like, trying to they're both appealing to emotions, like, trying to make the less the people that just like to hear, "Yeah, it's my team," go, like, they don't really care about politics, so, like, they just appeal to those guys 'cause they're, like, the loudest. I'm not putting this on strategically. What'd you think of it, though? Was that, like, such a negative answer of mine? It demands a lot of focus? Oh, yeah, it was fun. It's fun to do them live. Any debate reaction live, I feel like are fun because nobody's talked about it yet. You don't know you don't know what to expect. They're eating the dogs. So fucked up. I was just asking. I kinda stay out of politics. Yeah, I really didn't get into politics until I wanted to see change in certain I literally look like the thing from my favorite movie, Little Nicky, with the bra on its head. "Get in the flask, Adrian." Anyhow, it's cool. It's my religion. Betty from the Flintstones yeah. Wait, what's the Pebbles? Is that the young one? My sister looks like Pebbles. Really not supposed to use glycolic acid and tretinoin, but we live on the edge. This is the most exciting part of my day. Anyway, are you going to stream this week again? I was just asking. Yeah, trying to get back into the swing of things. Trying. It felt fake to me. Have you guys seen the ones before that? Like, everybody was talking about the Biden one, and, like, honestly, I only caught I don't even think I actually watched it. I think I read reports on it, so I, like, remember screenshots of it, but which is crazy because everybody was talking about how Biden needed his Adderall or some shit. He was, like, really gone. Use this as a mirror. Looking there or here. Anywho, I know I put the thumbnail as the debate because it's like We were gonna talk about it. I'm like kind of dying now. I think Kamala did better than Biden. Yeah. A lot of people are reporting that she did horrible, and I'm like, I feel like that's sexist. 'Cause, like, not the biggest fan, and that's me being polite, but, like, she had I guess she's fucking been speaking for a while. It's just like, I don't know. Sorry, I always suck at this shit when I can't hear myself. It's like the likes and the, go they're not in my paradigm until I have my headphones on. Definitely sexist. Don't just agree with me. There's gotta be a better way to store thermal rollers. Ladies, anybody? It's funny, I was watching another stream and I was heading off to bed, but I found out you were still streaming. So I figured I can stay up for a little while longer. Isn't that what you said the other day? Biden was like a 7-year-old. I used to really like Biden, like, fucking when I was young. This is not going well. Kamala did well for a woman. Tyrone, what the hell? Andrew always simping is wrong, but I don't care. Andrew? Like Andrew? I don't know how to do this at this moment. Okay, let's see what I have on deck. Didn't I download something earlier? Oh, did you guys hear about Candace Owens? I look insane right now. She got demonetized. Is this old news? Yeah, like where Andrew I read Andrew here. Vote what's in your best interest. That's what I always say. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, he's always making fun of simping. Yeah, but I'm sure Andrew has simped in his life. Don't make a habit of it. Just kidding. Let's see. So we can do the destiny thing with Jordan Peterson.
Okay. And then on the conservative end, I guess a conservative would generally think that tax money goes, you're basically able to take the problems of society, you're able to scrape off, hopefully, not super significant amount of money from people that can afford to give a lot of money, and then through government programs and redistribution, you target those taxes essentially to people that kind of need whatever bare minimum to take advantage of opportunities in society. Yeah.
Okay.
And then on the conservative end, I guess a conservative would generally think that why would the government take my money? I think from a community point of view, through churches, through community action, through families, we can better allocate our own dollars to our own friends and family to help them and give them the things that they need so that they can better participate in and thrive in society, basically.
Okay, so one of the things that I've always found a mystery, I mean, I think there's an equal mystery on the left and on the right in this regard, is that the more conservative types tend to be very skeptical of big government, and the leftist types tend to be more skeptical of big corporations.
Cool.
Right. Well, so following through the logic that you just laid out, you made the suggestion that one of the things that characterizes people on the left is the belief that government can act as an agent of can and should act as an agent of distribution. Okay. A potential problem for that is the gigantism of the government that does that. Now, the conservatives are skeptical of that gigantism. And likewise, the liberals, the progressives in particular, we'll call them progressives, are skeptical of the reach of gigantic corporations. And I've always seen a commonality in those two, in that both of them are skeptical of gigantism. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about, generally speaking, with regard to the potential for the rise of tyranny, is the emergence of giants. And one potential problem with the view that the government can and should act as an agent of redistribution is that there is an incentive put in place, two kinds of incentives. Number one, a major league incentive towards gigantism and tyranny. And number two, an incentive for psychopaths who use compassion to justify their grip on power, to take money and to claim that they're doing good. And I see that happening everywhere now, particularly in the name of compassion. And it's one of the things that's made me very skeptical, in particular about the left, and at least about the progressive edge of the left. So I'm curious about what you think about those two. First of all, it's a paradox to me that the conservatives and the leftists face off each other with regard to their concern about different forms of gigantism, and don't seem to notice that the thing that unites them is some antipathy. This is especially true for the libertarians, some antipathy towards gigantic structures per se. And so then I would say, with regards to your antithesis between liberalism and conservatives, the conservatives are pointing to the fact that there are intermediary forms of distribution that can be utilized to solve the social problems that you're describing, that don't bring with them the associated problem of gigantism. And like, it's been shocking to me to watch the left, especially in the last 6 years, ally itself, for example, with pharmaceutical companies, which was something I'd never thought I would see in my lifetime. I mean, for decades, the only gigantic corporations the left was more skeptical of than the fossil fuel companies were the pharmaceutical companies. And that all seemed to vanish overnight around the COVID time. So I know the story. That's a lot of things to throw at you, but it sort of outlines the territory that we could probably investigate productively.
Yeah, so a couple things. I would say that the current political landscape we have, I think, is less. I understand the concept of conservatives supporting corporations and liberals supporting like large government. I think today the divide we're starting to see more and more is more of like a populist, anti-populist rise, or even like an institutional or anti-institutional rise. So for instance, I think conservatives today in the United States are largely characterized with, I would say, with populism. In that they're supporting like certain figures, namely right now Donald Trump, who they think alone can kind of like lead them against the corrupt institutions, be them corporate or government. I feel like most conservatives today are not as trustful of big corporations as they were back in like the Bush era, where we would, conservatives would champion, big corporations.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
That's a strange thing, because it makes the modern conservatives a lot more like the 60s leftists.
Potentially, yeah.
I mean, that brings us into the issue, too, of whether the left-right divide is actually a reasonable way of construing the current political landscape at all. And I'm not sure it is, but
right now it kind of is, but only because so many conservatives are following Trump. So like your populist, anti-populist thing kind of maps on kind of cleanly to the left and right. It doesn't work with progressives, though, or the far left, because they're also anti-large everything. So in a surprising way, on very, very far left people, you might find them having a bit more in common with kind of like a MAGA Trump supporter than like a center-left liberal. So for instance, like both of these groups of people on the very far left will be very dovish on foreign policy, probably a little bit more isolationist. They're not a big fan of like a ton of immigration or a ton of trade with other countries. They might think that there's a lot of institutional capture of both government and corporations. So both all of the MAGA supporters and the far, far left might think that corporations don't have our best interest at heart and the government is corrupt and captured by lobbyists. You'll see a lot of overlap there.
Right.
I think that sometimes there's a couple things. One is just something I feel like I've discovered. People have no principles. I think that people are largely guided by whatever is kind of satisfying them or making them feel good at the time. I think that's a really important thing to understand, because people's beliefs will seem to change at random. If you're trying to imagine that a belief is coming from some underlying principle or is governed by some internal, like moral or reasonable code or whatever, I think generally there are large social groups and people kind of follow them along from thing to thing, which is why you end up in strange worlds sometimes where like the position on vaccines and being an anti-vaxxer might have been seen as something, 10 years ago as kind of like a hippie leftist. And now maybe it's more like a conservative, or it's associated more with like MAGA Trump supporters or whatever. I think as a result of how the social groups move around. When it comes to you mentioned this like gigantism thing. That's another thing where I'm not sure if people actually care about gigantism or if they're using it as a proxy for other things that they don't like. Like I could totally imagine
Well, I care about it.
Sure. Yeah, you might. Yeah, sorry. It just meant in general.
That's
yeah.
Okay.
Because like I could imagine somebody saying that like they don't trust like a large government, they think there's too much, prone to tyranny or something like that, but also be supportive of an institution like the Catholic Church, which is literally, one guy who is a direct line to God.
But they can't tax.
And
they don't have a military. They can't conscript you.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And they can't throw you in jail.
That is true. Yeah. I mean,
well, those are major and significant. I mean, I get the overlap. Don't get me wrong.
Sure. But I'm saying like, even if you had a local government, like if you had a state government or a tribe, usually they've got some form of enacting punishment. It'll be sometimes more brutal, but they can throw you in jail. Conscription hasn't existed in the US since the Vietnam War.
Yet.
I mean, yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah, true.
So yeah, I think that, I guess when I look at
let's go back. Well, let's go back to the redistribution issue.
Uh-huh.
I mean, we pay 65% of our income at, say, upper middle class to upper middle class level in Canada. It isn't obvious to me at all that money is well used. In fact, quite the contrary. In my country now, our citizens make 60% they produce 60% of what you produce in the US. That's plummeted over the last 20 years as state intervention has increased. I'm not convinced that the claim that the interests of people who lack opportunity are best served by state intervention. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, I'm aware of the relationship between inequality and social problem.
Uh-huh.
There's a very well-developed literature on that, and it essentially shows that the more arbitrary, the broader the reach of inequality in a political institution of any given size, the more social unrest. So where all people are poor, there isn't much social unrest, and where all people are rich, there isn't much social unrest. But when there's a big gap between the two, there's plenty, and that's mostly driven by disaffected young men who aren't very happy that they can't climb the hierarchy. There are barriers in their way. And so there is reason to ameliorate relative poverty. The problem with that, to some degree, is that most attempts to ameliorate relative poverty tend to increase absolute poverty, and they do it dramatically. And the only solution that we've ever been able to develop to that is something approximating a free market system. I wouldn't call it a capitalist system because I think that's capture of the terminology by the radical leftists. It's a free exchange system. And the price you pay for a free exchange system is you still have inequality, but the advantage you gain is that the absolute levels of privation plummet. And I think the data on that they're absolutely conclusive, and that's been especially demonstrated in the radical decrease in rates of poverty since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. Because we've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 4 decades than we had in the entire course of human history up to that date. And that's not least because...
I want to skip it. This is the boring part.
Wasn't an issue. What the hell do you think they did to the kulaks? That was forced redistribution. It resulted in the death of 6 million people. So maybe I'm not understanding what you mean, but that was redistribution at its like pinnacle.
Sure.
And forced redistribution. And it was brutal.
When I think of the strengths of capitalism, the ability for markets to dynamically respond to shifting consumer demand is like the reason why capitalism and free market economies dominate the world. When you've got socialist or communist systems, command economies where a government is trying to say, this is how much this is going to cost, this is how much you're going to produce and make. this is a failed way of managing a state economy. Even in places where they still do it, there are always shadow economies and stuff that were in the Soviet Union that prop up where people try to basically ameliorate the conditions that are resulting from said horrible command economy practices. So I guess in a way you could argue a command economy is kind of like redistribution. It's a form of it, but
no, it's a worse problem. If you're pointing to the fact that that's a worse problem, I'm
I would say that's definitely the reason why these places failed, because they just weren't able to respond to changing conditions.
Okay, so what's the difference between?
Going online without ExpressVPN is like leaving your kids with the nearest stranger while you go to the restroom. They're probably not a kidnapper or a serial killer, but why would you ever take that risk? Every time you connect to an unencrypted network in cafes, hotels, or airports, you leave your data vulnerable. Any hacker on the same network can steal your personal data, such as your passwords and financial
analysis has never been done as far as I know, so we actually don't know. And we could know if the social scientists would do their bloody job, which they don't, generally speaking. That's something we could know. We could probably use the AI systems we have now, the large language models, to determine to what degree left and right beliefs intermingled in the rise of National Socialism. So that's all technically possible. So, and it hasn't been done, so it's a matter of opinion.
Sure,
so,
I don't necessarily disagree. That's something you could do.
Okay, I was going to tell you this story. Okay, well, this has to do with the use of power. So I spent a time with a group of scholars putting...
The part that's coming up is the Moses part, which I believe is the question that Destiny got frustrated with Jordan Peterson about, because he was saying he was obfuscating. Got it.
And analyzing the Exodus story in Exodus seminar recently. And so the Exodus story is a very interesting story because it's what would you say? It's an analysis of the central tendency of movement away from tyranny and slavery. That's a good way of thinking about it. So the possibility of tyranny and the possibility of slavery are possibilities that present themselves to everyone within the confines of their life, psychologically and socially. You can be your own tyrant with regards to the imposition of a set of radical doctrines that you have to abide by and punish yourself brutally whenever you deviate from them. And we all contend with the issue of tyranny and slavery. And there's an alternative path, and that's what the Exodus story lays out. And Moses is the exemplar of that alternative path, although he has his flaws. And one of his flaws is that he turns too often to the use of force. So he kills an Egyptian, for example, an Egyptian noble who has slayed a Hebrew, one of Moses' Hebrew slave brothers, and he has to leave. There's a variety of indications in the text that he uses his staff, he uses his rod, and he uses power when he's supposed to use persuasion and legal or verbal invitation and argumentation. And this happens most spectacularly right at the end of the sojourn. So Moses has spent 40 years leading the Israelites through the desert, and he's right on the border of the promised land. And really what that means at a more fundamental basis is that he's at the threshold of attaining what he's been aiming at, what he's devoted his whole life to. And he's been a servant of that purpose in the highest order. And the Israelites are still in the desert, which means they're lost and confused. They don't know which way is up. They're still slaves. And now they're dying of thirst, which is what you die of, spiritual thirst, if you're sufficiently lost. And they go to Moses and ask him to intercede with God. And God tells Moses to speak to the rocks so that they'll reveal the water within. And Moses strikes the rocks with his rod twice instead, right? He uses force. And so God says to him, you'll now die before you enter the promised land. It's Joshua who enters and not Moses. Okay, and you might wonder why I'm telling you that story. I'm telling you that story because those concepts at the center of that cloud of concepts that you described are stories, right? They're stories. And if they're well formulated, they're archetypal stories. And this is an archetypal story that's illustrating the danger of the use of compulsion and force. You know, and so one of the problems you're obviously obsessed by and that I'm trying to solve is what do we do as an alternative to tyranny, whether it's for a utopian purpose in the future or maybe for the purpose of like conservatives censoring music lyrics they don't approve of. And one answer is we don't use force. We do the sort of thing that you and I are trying to do right now, which is to have a conversation that's aimed at clarifying things. And so that's a principle that's something like the consent of the governed, right? It's something like, but it's also something like you have the right to go to hell in a handbasket if that's what you choose. And as long as you don't, in doing so, you're not in everyone's way too much. You have the right to your own destiny, right? And so, and you don't get to use power to impose that. That's the other thing that worries me about what's going on the utopian front, because the problem is, once you conjure up a climate apocalypse and you make the case that there's an impending disaster that's delayed, and you might say, well, delayed how long? And the response would be, well, we're not sure, but it's likely to occur in the next 100 or so years, which is pretty inaccurate. You now have a universal get out of jail card that can be utilized extremely well by power mad psychopaths. And they will absolutely do that because power mad psychopaths use whatever they can to further their cause.
So this is my issue, I think. This is my issue with a lot of people when it comes to political conversations. I think that everything you've said is true. And I think that all of it it's good analysis, but I feel like it just gets wielded sometimes in one direction. And then people kind of miss that it completely and fully describes their entire side as well. And the thing that I feel like the only solution for this is you hinted at it. It's more than just conversation, although that's a good start. We have to go back to inhabiting similar areas. We have to go back to inhabiting similar media landscapes. I think that the issue that we're running into right now more than anything else is people live in completely separate realities at the moment, such that if we were even to describe basic reality, how many illegal immigrants came into the United States last year? That should be a factual number that we can know.
How many do you think?
Somebody, the actual number, probably in the hundreds of thousands. I think some conservatives think it's 3 million per year over the past 3 years because they look at border contacts or they look at asylum seekers and they're not looking at
I think it's 3.6 million.
Came into the U.S. and stayed?
Yes, through the southern border.
Okay. So
the historical average is about 1 million.
I understand the chart. Well, historically, there's 13 to 15 million people full stop in the United States illegally. That's the whole history of illegal immigration in the United States. But but hey, maybe I'm wrong there, right? So we can say that's an example of us living in a fundamentally different reality.
Well, the Pew Research Group has established quite conclusively that the variability over the last 20 years for illegal migration in the south border is between 300,000 and 1.2 million.
Well, the Pew Research can only establish, I think, the number of people attempting to cross. I don't know if they can know. I don't know if Pew does census analysis. I'd have to see.
Well, that's a different issue, right?
Sure.
Because I don't know how you measure how many illegal immigrants there are actually in the country.
I understand. I just want to point out, I agree with you. I listened to a lot of Rush Limbaugh growing up. I understand the fear of having a government agency say climate change, therefore we have a blank check to do whatever we want. That's scary.
Which is what they are doing.
The conservatives do the same thing, though.
I'm not claiming otherwise.
Yeah, but the problem is I think people don't talk about it. So for instance, so we can pretend now that the conservative argument was just compulsory vaccines are bad because they infringe on my freedom. That wasn't the conservative argument. The conservative argument was that mass deaths were going to happen, mass side effects were going to happen. There was going to be all this corruption and stuff related to vaccine distribution, to the crazier theories for microchips and blah, blah, blah. None of that came true. Absolutely none of the conservative fear-mongering related to the mRNA vaccines came to fruition. But now that's all forgotten. And that was used
What do you mean
as an
none of
excuse
it? What do you make of the excess?
Imagine being able to transition academic papers, textbooks, websites, emails, or PDFs into an audio format that you can listen to while on
COVID was so close to zero that it might as well have been zero.
When you're talking about a disease, the risk of death isn't the only thing that you worry about for the disease. Also,
so you're going to talk about transmission? Because that was another thing that the COVID vaccine pushed. Yeah, but it didn't do anything to transmission.
It absolutely did because it decreased your chance of getting affected. It didn't destroy. It didn't get rid of transmission, but it reduced transmission.
Yeah, but it was claimed that it would get rid of transmission.
Only if you take one reading of one single quote. I think that Biden said one time where he said, "No, come on." I've heard so many times because everybody say, "Oh, you can't take anything Trump says seriously." Biden one time on the news says, if you get the vaccine, you won't transfer the disease.
That is so silly.
Which was it? No.
Do you know that our prime minister in Canada deprived Canadians of the right to travel for 6 months? because the unvaccinated were going to
Wait,
transmit
somebody in
COVID
the
with more
comments was
likelihood
like,
than.
it feels like as if Jordan Peterson and Destiny are like father and son, and they stayed at the kitchen table after everybody already got up and left or something. I said that horribly, but
Than the vaccinated. So this wasn't one bloody statement. This was
hold on.
thorough government policy
What
in
I'm
my
saying
country.
is there wasn't a statement given that if you get vaccinated, there is a 0% chance of transmitting the disease. The idea is that vaccines were supposed to help because it reduces your hospitalization, it reduces death, and it reduces transmission, hopefully by making it so that people don't get sick or don't get sick for as long. All three of those things, the vaccines did exceedingly well. They continue to do that to this day, but especially for the first variant and then the Delta variant, the vaccines helped immensely here. They were tested. The myocarditis rates are like 7 out of 100,000 injections, and the myocarditis is generally acute, and it's generally not as bad as even getting the coronavirus itself, which will lead you also to having
It's a much worse side effect than side effects that have caused other vaccines to be taken off the market before.
A 7 out of 100,000 rate of acute myocarditis or pericarditis is not a worse side effect than any other vaccine. I think that is a completely acceptable, given that the disease itself is more likely to cause myocarditis or pericarditis.
Yes, I don't think the data suggests to support that presupposition anymore. The latest peer-reviewed studies show that that's simply not true, especially among young men.
So there is an age bracket of young men where the elevated rate of myocarditis, acute myocarditis from the vaccine might have been higher, but we're talking about like 3 or 4 cases per 100,000 people. And again, myocarditis, pericarditis are generally acute conditions.
Well,
they don't last for very long.
I told you at the beginning of this conversation that the progressive leftists were on the side of the pharmaceutical companies.
It's not about being on the side of the pharmaceutical companies. It's about yeah.
What I see as the unholy part of that alliance with the pharmaceutical companies is that it dovetails with the radical utopians' willingness to use power to impose their utopian vision.
Well, then what do you make
Because
of the
otherwise,
fact
how
that-
would you explain it? Because the leftists should have been the ones that were most skeptical about the bloody pharmaceutical companies. And they jumped on the vaccine bandwagon in exactly the same way that you're doing right now.
Pharmaceutical companies have helped us tremendously throughout the...
Right, there we go. Fine. No,
think modern
I don't
medicine
think
hasn't?
so. No, I don't think so.
You're just wrong.
I think they're
You're
utterly
completely wrong.
I see. So you don't think that the pharmaceutical companies who dominate the advertising landscape with 75% of the funding are corrupt?
Corrupt is a very broad...
No, it's...
Do you think that
corrupt with a tinge of malevolence, willing to extract money out of people by putting their health on the line? You don't believe that?
Do you think that we get effective drugs from pharmaceutical companies?
Not particularly.
Okay. Do you think that any vaccines work?
Yes.
Do you think that any...
I don't think 80 of them work at once for babies. I think that's a little risky.
But yet we've been on this vaccine schedule for how many decades?
Like this, not like this, not carefully.
I had a ton of vaccines when I was a child. I'm pretty sure that was the norm for people. There were a ton of vaccines.
There's way more now.
Okay. And you think
you can understand why. I mean, look, part of it, no doubt, part of it is a consequence of the genuine willingness to protect children. But the moral hazard is quite clear, and people on the left used to be aware of this.
What do you think the mRNA vaccine, the speeding up of it came from? How do you make for the fact that it was Donald Trump that did warp speed?
Terror. Foolish panicking, just like we're doing with the climate issue.
So you think Trump was
panicking?
Was he in bed with the pharmaceuticals? Was he working with the left, or was it just that was the only panicky thing he made? He didn't try to push for the mass lockdowns like other far left people would have wanted him to do. That was just the one mistake he made, was the pushing for the vaccine?
No, I think Trump undoubtedly made all sorts of mistakes, and it certainly wasn't only the left that stampeded toward the forced COVID vaccine debacle. But it was most surprising to me that it emerged on the left, because the left at least had been protected against the depredations of gigantic predatory corporations by their skepticism of the gigantic enterprises that can engage in regulatory capture, and that just vanished.
Is it not possible that maybe people looked and they said, hey, if all the governments, all the institutions, all the schools, all the private companies across all the countries around the world are saying the same thing, maybe it is the case that this vaccine just helps? Is that not possible?
Oh, sure. Of course it's possible, but that didn't mean it was right.
Well,
they used force.
Well,
they used force.
We use force for all sorts of things in terms of public health.
We don't generally use force to invade people's bodies.
How long have vaccine mandates been a thing in Canada, the United States, and the entire world?
I don't think they should have been a thing.
That's great if you don't think they should have been, but when you say we don't generally use force, we absolutely use force. We've enforced vaccines for a long time. It's an important part of public health.
Fair enough. We did it on a scale and at a rate during the COVID pandemic, so-called pandemic, that was unparalleled. And the consequence of that was that we injected billions of people with an experimental, it wasn't a bloody vaccine.
Of course
it wasn't.
Yes, it was.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It's
not.
not.
Isn't it a 100% success rate? You think it's a definition of vaccine? Well, the point of the vaccine is to give your body a protein to train on so that your immune system works. Who cares if it's not the same? There's different types.
They used the word vaccine so that they didn't have to contend with the fact that it wasn't the same technology.
There are different types of vaccines that are different technologies.
Fine.
The mRNA vaccines is a type of vaccine technology.
Vaccines. Now this is vaccines.
No, it was like this, and now it's like this.
No.
Wait.
It was like...
Sorry, this thing's like that. Pausing. I don't know if I don't think Jordan Peterson is against the vaccine. The vaccine. Oh my God, shoot me. Throw the whole bitch away. I think he's upset about the enforcement of it. Like forcing people to do it. I don't think he's actually mad about the vaccine itself, though.
Like this, and now it's like this. The mRNA technology was a radical, qualitative leap forward in technology. You can call it...
He can say that, but at the same time, it was a public health emergency. You know, it's like, what are you going to do? I don't think it's right, but that's what we do when we panic.
The vaccine if you want to, but it bears very little resemblance to any vaccine that went before that.
But anybody who's gotten it is fine. And then people I know that didn't get it are also fine. So
the reason it was called a vaccine was because vaccine was a brand name that had a track record of safety, and shoehorning it in that was one of the ways to make sure that people weren't terrified of the technology. And
I think the reason it's called a vaccine is because they're injecting you with something that's inoculating you against something in the future, because it has proteins that resemble a virus that infects
there
your
are
immune
overlaps
system.
between the mRNA technologies and vaccines, to be sure, but they wouldn't have been put forward with the rate that they were put forward if they weren't a radical new technology. And it's bad in principle to inject billions of people with an untested new technology.
Isn't it also bad in principle for billions of people to get infected with a worldwide pandemic that initially was causing a decent number of deaths, a ton of complications, shutting down world economies?
Maybe it was.
So shouldn't we be able to engage in that analysis and figure out, like, if we look at the
we're not engaging in the analysis.
No, because now we're talking about...
At least Jordan Peterson can be like, you're right. He always can acknowledge the other person's point of view. Like a lot of times people are like, no.
Whether or not vaccines or even vaccines or not instead.
No, don't play that game. That is not what I was doing. I was making a very specific and careful case. The mRNA technology, by wide recognition, is an extraordinarily novel technology. And
that doesn't make it not a vaccine, though.
Well, okay, it's a radically transformed form of vaccine. I don't give a damn. That still makes it something so new that the potential danger of its mass administration was highly probable to be at least or more dangerous than the thing that it was supposed to protect against. And we are seeing that in the excess deaths.
Absolutely not saying. So are you implying now that the excess deaths were caused by the vaccines? Or
I don't bloody well know what they're caused by.
That's what you're implying now.
Well, look, if you're going to use Occam's razor, you're kind of stuck in an awkward place here.
I'm absolutely not stuck in it. This is the most administered vaccine in the or inoculation, or whatever you prefer to call it, in the history of all of mankind. Every single organization around the world is motivated to call this out if it was a bad thing. You don't think Russia or China would be screaming if Donald Trump or the United States warp sped through a vaccine that was having deleterious effects on populations all around the world? You don't think there wouldn't be some academic institution? You didn't think there'd be more than a handful of doctors and Joe Rogan and some conservatives saying this vaccine might have been bad if it was the case that American companies working with companies in Europe and Germany especially, right? That's where BioNTech is from.
No, I don't think they would say anything if they knew they fucked up. But I'm also a little bit conspiratorial, so take what I say with a grain of salt.
In order to create or manufacture a vaccine that was causing excess deaths all around the world, there are so many different people that we motivated to call this out. How do you explain the fact that
calling it out?
No, it's a handful of people. Where are the governments calling it out? Where are the academic institutions calling it out? Where are the other private companies calling it out? Wouldn't you stand to make a killing if you were a private company in Europe and you could say, look, the mRNA vaccines for sure are causing all of these issues? Why wouldn't Putin? Why wouldn't Xi Jinping? Why wouldn't anybody else in the world call this out? It was as horrible as it was.
There are plenty of people attempting to call
Nobody credible and no huge institution.
Wait, hold on. Well, it was censored on YouTube up until very recently. You couldn't say vaccine or jab, and anybody that did got censored. Like, what are you talking about? Oh, wait. Sorry, I don't have my headphones on. He's talking about, nobody decided to debunk the idea by
make of the excess death.
Well, still, it only was.
You haven't come up with a bloody hypothesis.
I don't even know if there are 20% at the excess deaths in Europe right now. If I had to guess off the top of my head, it's going to be, like you said, one might be lingering effects of an overwhelmed healthcare system. Another one might be deaths related to the war in Ukraine. Another one might be rising energy costs that have happened for a couple of reasons.
But it's absolutely impossible that any of it could be unintended consequences of a novel technology injected into billions of people.
I think that if excess, first of all, there aren't billions of people in Europe. So if there were excess deaths, I understand, but you're talking about excess deaths in Europe. I'm not aware of excess deaths that exist in other places that are completely and totally unaccounted for, where the only explanation would be the vaccine. I think if there were, I think more people would be talking about it.
Well, first of all, the number of people talking about something is not an indication of the scientific validity of a claim.
I agree with that, but for a vaccine,
then why are you using mass consensus as the determinant of what constitutes truth?
Because I think for something,
that's never been the case.
Because I think for something that was given to billions and billions of people, if this was something that was having a measurable effect on people, it would be impossible to cover it up or ignore it. Well, we wouldn't have to look at the one case brought up on a documentary. We would have to look at the one thing being talked about.
And what do you make of the VAERS data? There's more negative side effects reported from the mRNA vaccines than there were reported for every single vaccine ever created since the dawn of time, and not by a small margin. So it's not just the excess deaths.
I agree.
It's the VAERS data.
What is VAERS data?
It's the database that until the COVID-19 pandemic emerged, and we had the unfortunate consequence that there were so many side effects being reported, it was the gold standard for determining whether or not vaccines were safe. And now, as soon as it started to misbehave on the mRNA vaccine front, we decided that we were going to doubt the validity of the VAERS reporting system.
Okay, the VAERS reporting system never been the gold standard for anything. VAERS reporting is just if you want to report that there is some issue that you have after getting a vaccine. That's it. I think it's vaccine adverse.
What the hell do you think it was set up for?
To report adverse events that happen after a vaccine.
Why?
To track and see if something was related to the vaccine.
Right.
So
why?
most people didn't even know VAERS existed until after the COVID vaccine. Once people know that it exists, of course, more people are going to engage with it. But what happens?
So it's all noise.
No, it could be or couldn't be. So what do you do when a bunch of stuff?
Well, you first of all might begin by suggesting that maybe it's not all noise.
Correct. So when all of these things are admitted to VAERS, what they do is from there they investigate. All you can do, all VAERS is I might go and get a vaccine, and maybe in 3 days I go, I got a headache. I'm going to go ahead and call my doctor and make this report. And they'll say, okay, well, it's an adverse event after vaccine. Doesn't mean the vaccine caused the headache. And now that more people know about this system than ever,
I'm saying that
VAERS is not the gold standard of determining if a vaccine is working or not.
What?
Compared to actual longitudinal, perspective, randomized control trial studies.
You mean like the ones they should have done to the goddamn vaccines?
Like the ones that they did do for the vaccines and they continue to do to this day. Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
Yes,
you really think that you're in a position to evaluate the scientific credibility of the trials for the vaccines, do you?
No, really? I don't. So I have to trust.
Then what are you doing? I don't trust them. I looked at the bloody data.
First of all, you have to trust third parties to some extent. When you go outside,
I don't have to trust.
Of course you do. You do every day. When you turn the keys in your car, you hope your engine doesn't explode. When you're drinking water, you hope that the public water or whatever tap or bottled water you got it out of isn't contaminated or poisoned with cholera.
I don't do that as a consequence of consensus.
No, you of course you do.
No, I don't. I do that as a consequence of observing multiple times that when I put the goddamn key in the ignition, the truck started.
Why do you know it's going to start the 50th or the 100th time? How many times do you wear
those? With me.
I'm not playing Hume. You don't know if the denim in those jeans isn't leaking into your bloodstream. To some extent, we have to trust third-party institutions to make determination.
When they use force. How about
Especially
that?
when they use force. We trust the police officers. We trust the judicial systems.
We do. We on the left trust the police, do
to some extent, do we? If somebody's breaking into your house, who do you call?
Them.
I'm not a defunder, but if somebody's breaking into your house, you can be the most defund person in the world. Who are you going to call? Are you going to call your neighbor? Are you going to call Joe Biden? Are you going to call Obama? Are you going to call the Black Panthers? You're going to call the cops.
So tell me this. Tell me this then, because the core issue here is use of force, as far as I'm concerned. You know, we examined some of the weeds around that.
It's self.
Politicians throughout the world, and this would be true on the conservative side now, in the aftermath of the COVID tyranny, because it was more a tyranny than a pandemic, are now saying that we actually didn't force anybody to take the vaccine. So what do you think of that claim? Like, so let's define force.
I think it's technically true, but I think it's silly.
What do you mean it's technically true? Define
technically
force,
true,
then.
and that in the United States, at least, I think the idea, what they tried to do, they weren't able to do it because the Supreme Court shot it down, was Biden tried to make it so that OSHA, who's the body that regulates job safety, could make it so that employees had to get vaccinated. Now, eventually, that it was, or they'd lose their job.
Okay, does that qualify as force?
That's why I said technically.
Yeah, I know, but it's a serious question. I mean, because we need to define what constitutes force before we can. It seems to me.
You could argue it's a type of force, sure. I mean, I think it'd be silly to say it's nothing. It is a type of force. It's the same as a cop telling you have to do this, you're going to be killed. No, but it's on the spectrum. Sure, of course, yeah.
It's as much force as the mRNA vaccines are vaccines.
Sure. It is a type of force, and the mRNA vaccines are a type of vaccine.
Look, I really think the problem was with the COVID response. I really think the problem was the use of force. I mean, I can understand to some degree, although I'm very skeptical of the pharmaceutical companies, and far more skeptical than your insistence upon the utility of consensus might lead me to believe you're skeptical of them, which is surprising, I would say, given that I'm very skeptical of them.
That's why I'm glad there's multiple companies, multiple countries, multiple academic institutions that do research, and the FDA. Yeah, I'm very skeptical. You should be in any private system. You should be skeptical of every private company, of course, whether we're talking media, pharmaceuticals, or automobile manufacturers.
Remember the anti-vax, like hippies, not too long ago? That was the left.
Sure is, yeah. But skepticism doesn't mean a blind adherence to the complete total opposite of whatever it is they're saying, right? There are undoubtedly, like, if you look at Alzheimer's research, there's been groundbreaking improvements on drugs to treat Alzheimer's research over the past 3 years that 5 years ago, none of these drugs even existed. And now, yeah, so I mean—
How about if you're skeptical of anyone who's willing to use force to put their doctrine forward?
Then you're skeptical of literally every single person, political ideology ever have existed in all of humankind. Some degree of force, you would undoubtedly believe this, right? Some degree of force is probably necessary for any kind of cohesive society, right?
No, I don't believe that.
Of course there is.
No,
even if you had a tribe of 100, 120 people, if somebody was stealing something, right? You have to punish that person.
I said earlier that becomes complicated when you're dealing with the psychopathic types. Right, so that's a complication. But I would say, generally speaking, that the necessity to use force is a sign of bad policy. And no, I don't think, I'm not particularly Hobbesian. I don't think that the only reason people comport themselves with a certain degree of civility in civilized society is because they're terrified by the fact that the government has a monopoly on force that can be brought against them at any moment. I think that keeps the psychopaths in line.
This is where fucking Peterson loses me. It's like, you're a psychologist. You understand human behavior. You understand abnormal human behavior. And like, I don't know for sure. It's like, you really think that's what stops people? People are going to behave. It might stop a pro-social behavior person or person with pro-social behavior, but people who are going to commit crimes are going to commit crimes with or without enforcement.
Some degree, but I think that most people are enticed into a cooperative relationship, and that formulating the structures that make those relationships possible is a sign of good policy.
I have to ask, because I have watched a lot of your stuff in the past. I remember you speaking very distinctly on this, that, for instance, when two men are communicating with each other, there is an underlying threat of force that kind of puts on the guardrails those particular social interactions. For instance,
the threat of force is don't be psychopathic.
How broader is psychopathic here? Are we defining?
Well, I can define it. I mean,
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Well, a psychopath will gain short-term advantage at the cost of long-term relationship.
Okay.
That's really the core issue. Well, you know, you made a reference to something like that earlier in your discussion when you pointed out that people claim to be motivated, let's say, by principle, but will default to short-term gratification more or less at the
For
drop of
social
a hat.
goods, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the exaggerated proclivity to do that is at the essence of psychopathy. So it's very
Do you think, I'm curious, with this definition of psychopathy, does that mean
the definition of psychopathy. It's not it's not mine. That's the core of psychopathy.
Okay, I'm not in the United States. I think we call it all ASPD now.
No, it's separate from that's antisocial personality disorder.
I thought that subsumed psychopathy and sociopathy.
Psychopathy is more like it's more the pathological core of antisocial personality disorder.
Okay, maybe that might be true. Okay,
that's a better way of thinking. Like the worst. A small number of criminals are responsible for the vast majority of crimes. It's 1% commit 65%, something like that.
Do you think is psychopathy something that can be environmentally induced, or do you think this is core to a person?
It's both.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're disagreeable, like you are, by the way, your proclivity, if you went wrong, would be to go wrong in an antisocial and psychopathic direction. That's more true of men, for example, than it is for women. That's why men are more likely to be in prison by a lot.
So men do have a proclivity to narcissism. Kidding. Love you.
It's 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 generally. It depends on the particular crime, with it being higher proportion of men as the violence of the crime mounts. So you can imagine on the genetic versus environment side. So imagine that when you're delivered your temperamental hand of cards, you're going to have a certain set of advantages that go along with it.
It's like he's literally about to go into how like nature versus nurture or whatever. And it's like, and you still think, well, I guess they both do. They both believe in free will.
Them that are part and parcel of that genetic determination. And there's going to be a certain set of temptations as well. So for example, if you're high in trait neuroticism, you're going to be quite sensitive to the suffering of others and be able to detect that. That's useful for infant care. But the cost you'll pay is that you'll be more likely to develop depression and anxiety.
Like Jordan.
And if you're disagreeable, extroverted and unconscientious, then the place you'll go if you go badly is in the psychopathic or antisocial direction. And there are environmental determinants of that to some degree.
Sure. Genes express themselves in an environment. I agree. When I'm just curious for the definition of psychopathy, for short-term gain at the expense of long-term
relationship. Really, that's probably the best bit. Yeah.
When you look at stuff like people that are self-destructive, say people that engage in behaviors like obesity, is that like a type of psychopathy to you, or is that like something different, or how do you define these types of things, I guess, or how do you view that type of thing?
Well, the
self-interest. Oh, is he saying like desires?
No, there is an overlap.
Psychopathy. Isn't it like when it's inflicted on others? It's like narcissism isn't bad for you, technically. If you have it, it's bad for people around you. I don't know. I'm just trying to guess before they
in that addictive processes, one of which might lead to obesity, do have this problem of prioritization of the short term. But so that overlaps with the short-term orientation of the psychopath. But a psychopath is, see, an obese person isn't gaining anything from your demise to facilitate their obesity, right? So there's a predatory and parasitical element to psychopathy that's not there in other addictive short-term processes.
Do you think, is it possible that there are things, because then to circle back to the tribal example I gave, isn't it possible that people can commit harms against other people where they're not necessarily gaining from their demise, but it's just some other sort of gain that they're thinking about it? So for instance, like say like I'm talking to some friends and I'm just gossiping or shit talking another person. I'm not necessarily feeling good that I'm trashing them per se. I'm feeling good because this group of friends might view me more favorably because I have like a gossip or something to share with them.
Well, but that's the gain right there. And you are contributing to the demise of the people
you are,
that you're gossiping about.
But I think I feel like there's fundamentally different type of thought process between like, I want to tell you something juicy about this guy because it'll make you like me, versus I want to tell you something juicy about this guy because I hate this guy and I want him to like have a worse reputation among people. I feel like there's different drivers for that.
I would say that's an interesting distinction. I would say probably that the hatred induced malevolence
It's
is a
different than
worse
the-
form of malevolence than the popularity-inducing malevolence.
Yeah, the
You know,
only reason
it's a tough one, but
yeah, the only reason I bring that up is because I feel like a lot of malevolence that we have social guardrails for is that type of like selfish malevolence where you're not. I would argue even the majority of malevolence in the world is usually people acting selfishly or being inconsiderate, not necessarily like, I hate this
yeah,
person,
I
wanna
think
do
that's
something."
right.
Sure,
I think
okay.
that, well, that's why Dante outlined levels of hell,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, well, exactly that. And I mean, that book was an investigation into the structure of malevolence, right? He put betrayal at the bottom, which I think is right. I think that's right, because people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, which almost only accompanies an encounter with malevolence rather than tragic circumstances, they are often betrayed, sometimes by other people, but often by themselves. And yes, there are levels of hell, you know, and you outlined a couple there.
So I guess then my question is just that if you have people, so the kid that steals an orange from a stand, not because he hates the shop owner, but because he wants the orange or he's hungry, without some type of societal, it doesn't have to be the government, it could be family, religious, without some type of use of force, do you think that society ever exists without
Use force on your wife?
Well, what are we considering force? Is withholding sex, for instance, is that considered force? Or is, you know, saying we're going to cancel a vacation?
Deprivation of an expected reward is a punishment. So you
sure.
could, well, no, but I mean, this is a serious question. I mean,
Yeah.
look, if we're thinking about the optimization
Girls,
of
write
social
that down.
structures, we might
Bitches, write that down. Write that down.
as well start from the base level of social structure and scaffold up.
Sure. So
Right.
I was like, if a wife is upset at a husband, for instance, would that be considered use of force? I think a negative punishment. You're removing a stimulus to punish a person for something. Yeah. Would you consider that like a use of force? Or
I would say it would depend to some degree on the intent.
the intent is to punish it?
Well, if the intent is to punish, then it's starting to move into the domain of force. I mean, look, while we've been talking, you know, there's been bursts of emotion, right?
Yeah.
And that's because we're freeing entropy and trying to close and to enclose it again. And so that's going to produces negative emotion fundamentally, most fundamentally anxiety and pain, and secondarily something like anger, because those emotions are quite tightly linked.
Sure.
And so within the confines of a marriage, because we might as well make it concrete, there are going to be times when disagreements result in bursts of emotion. And those bursts of emotion don't necessarily have to have an instrumental quality, right? It's when the emotion is used manipulatively to gain an advantage that's short-term for the person. And then maybe that's at the expense of the other person, or even at the expense of the person who benefits future self. Then it starts to tilt into the manipulative. There's a tetrad of traits. So narcissism, Machiavellianism, that's manipulativeness. Narcissism is the desire for unearned social status. That's what you'd gain, for example, if you were gossiping and elevating your social status. Machiavellianism, narcissism,
for unearned social status. I knew it. We were just talking about that the other day.
That's predatory parasitism. And those culminate in sadism. And that cloud of negative emotion that's released in the aftermath of disagreement can be tilted in the direction of those traits. And that's when it becomes malevolent. And that's when the problem of force starts to become paramount. Because I think that your fundamental presupposition was both Hobbesian and ill-formed. I do not believe that the basis for the civilized polity is force. Now, you're saying that, you know, you can't abjure the use of force entirely. And I would say, unfortunately, that's true.
I would agree with you.
But if the policy isn't invitational, if I can't make a case that's powerful enough for you to go there voluntarily, then the policy is flawed. Now, it may be that we have some cases where we can't do better than a flawed policy because we're not smart enough. And maybe the incarceration of criminals with a long-term history of violent offenses is a good example of that. We don't know how to invite those people to play. They have a history, generally from the time they're very young children, from the age of 2, of not being able to play well with others. And it's a very, very intractable problem. There's no evidence in the social science literature at all that hyper-aggressive boys by the age of 4 can ever be socialized in the course of their life. The penological evidence suggests that if you have multiple offenders, your best bet is to keep them in prison till they're 30. And the reason for that is it might be delayed maturation. biologically speaking, but most criminals start to burn out at around 27. So it spikes, it's a big spike when puberty hits, and then stability among the hyper-aggressive types. So actually what happens is the aggressives at 4 tend to be aggressive their whole life, and then they decline after 27. The normal boys are not aggressive. They spike at puberty and go back down to baseline, right? And so you don't really rehabilitate people in prison for obvious reasons. I mean, look at the bloody places. They're great schools for crime in large, but if you keep them there until they're old enough, they tend to mature out of that, except the worst of them tend to mature.
Remember how I said men should start out in jail based on science? I'm kidding. Not gonna lock you up.
Out of that predatory, short-term oriented lifestyle. So and that's the force issue.
I agree. So fundamentally,
wouldn't you say that men inherently seek short-term gratification? I mean, I'm sure women do too, but I'm thinking of like corn.
To clear my stance up, I agree that fundamentally you're not building society on force. If for no other reason, because there'd be so much friction, it would fly apart at the seams, right? You can't force.
You get resistance if you use force.
Fundamentally we're building off of cooperation. You want to invite people to participate in society. I agree with that. I feel like once you start to hit certain thresholds or certain points, and you've got so many different types of people involved, at some point, we're going to have force around the edges on the guardrails just to make sure that we don't allow. Are you familiar with like tit for tat systems?
Very.
Yeah, tit for tat is probably a really important part of our evolutionary biological history and an important part of the animal kingdom. And I think to some degree that tit for tat punishment.
Everybody in chat, I want you to type a bar, like a rap lyric, that when we read it, we know it's Jordan Peterson. Go.
It's important.
Is that force or justice?
You can call it what it is.
No. I'm curious what you think. This is a very serious question.
Yeah.
Because the tit for tat is very bounded, right? It's like you cheat, I whack you, and then I cooperate, right? So, and I do think that there's a model there for what we actually conceptualize as justice.
Sure.
It's like you don't get to get away with it, but the goal is the reestablishment of the cooperative endeavor as fast as possible.
Of course, I agree. But in a reductionist way, we're kind of just using justice here as a stand-in for force, right?
Well,
because a tit for tat system.
That's a good.
So there are different types of tit for tat systems, right? You've got tit for tat, you've got tit for tat tat, there's all sorts of type systems where maybe you'll let somebody make a mistake 1 or 2 times, but you can't have a tit system because then somebody can come in and take advantage of it.
Yes, which is the problem with the compassionate left, by the way.
To some extent, sure, it can be. Or a problem with the right that's far too forgiving of Donald Trump. But I would say that tat part, you can call it justice. I think justice is a perspective of force, right? Where some people might consider a force to be just, the cop that arrests the murderer, and other people might consider that force, that tat, to actually be injustice because the murderer was responding to environmental conditions, blah, blah, blah.
That's a stupid theory, that responding to environmental conditions theory. Because here's why it's not.
Because essentially that's Rittenhouse. Self-defense is responding with violence.
So if you assume that there's a causal pathway from early childhood abuse to criminality, let's say, which is the test case for environmental determination of the proclivity for the exploitation of others, then it spreads near exponentially in populations. That isn't what happens. So here's the data. Most people who abused their children were abused as children, but most people who are abused as children do not abuse their children. And the reason for that is because if you were abused, there's 2 lessons you can learn from that. One is identify with the abuser. The other is right, exactly. And what happens, and if this didn't happen, every single family would be abusive to the core very rapidly. What happens is the proclivity for violence itself, it dampens itself out as a consequence of intergenerational transmission. So the notion that privation is a pathway to criminality, that's not a well-founded formulation. And there are an infinite number of counterexamples, and they're crucial. And some of the best people I know, and I mean that literally, are people who had childhood so absolutely abysmal that virtually anything they would have done in consequence could have been justified. And they chose not to turn into the predators of others. And that was a choice, and often one that caused them to reevaluate themselves right down to the bottom of their soul. And so that casual association of relative poverty, even with criminality, we know this too. You take a neighborhood where there's relative poverty, the young men get violent. They don't get violent because they're all hurt and they're victims. They get violent because they use violence to seek social status. And so even in that situation, it's not, oh, the poor. It's no wonder they're criminal because they need bread. It's like, sorry, buddy, that's not how it works. The hungry women feeding their children don't become criminals. The extraordinarily ambitious young men who feel it's unfair that their pathway to success become violent. And that's 100% well documented, and generally by radically left-leaning scholars.
Sure,
So,
I don't disagree with any of that. Wealth inequality in areas is a much better predictor of crime than poverty, than absolute
right, but
poverty.
it's a very specific form of crime. It's
sure.
status-seeking crime by young men. Right, well, but that shows you what the underlying motive is. It's not even redress of the economic inequality. It's actually the men striving to become sexually attractive by gaining position in the dominance hierarchy.
Well, I think you have to be really careful with that assessment, though, because you can say that it's not economically, it's not seeking economic.
Why do you have to be careful? The biggest predictor of male.
Well, because we're assuming that people that commit crime in these types of circumstances are status seeking and not trying to seek economic remedy. But
That's
it might
exactly
be
what we're assuming.
But it might be the case, for instance, that in economically prosperous areas, that the men there aren't actually seeking economic prosperity. They're also just trying to elevate status, but they do it through economic prosperity. It's potential, right?
They do it with a longer term vision in mind. Sure, they're trying to elevate. I wouldn't disagree with that in the least.
Sure.
But they do it with a much longer time horizon in mind. And we know this partly because there have been detailed studies of gang members, for example, in Chicago, who are trying to ratchet themselves up the economic ladder, but they do it with a short-term orientation. Most of them think they're going to be dead by their early 20s.
Sure.
So they're trying to maximize short-term gain. So it has nothing to do with the redress of economic inequality, except in the most fundamental sense. And it is status-driven because they're looking for comparative status.
Sure, I understand what you're saying. I don't think any human being has baked in a desire to seek economic prosperity. I think that that's like a third order thing that we look for. And fundamentally, it's probably more like safety, security for ourselves, and then status seeking for other things.
I think that changes when you have children.
No, well, I mean, the safety and
Because
security,
your
but extends to your
status is
children.
irrelevant or starts to become irrelevant at that point.
I mean, depending on how you view your status, right?
You can't do that every time we have a discussion.
Sure. Well, I'm just saying, for instance, one of the important things for my child is to be able to send my child to a good school. I need to have an elevated status, right? I need to be able to buy a house at the right school district, or I need to be able to pay the education.
Right, but you're not telling me, I hope, that the driving factor behind your desire to care for your children is an elevation in your status.
No, but I'm saying that the elevation of status might be what allows you to take care of children. So, for instance, one of the biggest predictors of getting married is already
status
achieving
or position.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a.
I know
all of these things kind of play into
Okay, look, we're running out of time.
Yeah, you're good.
You're smart.
Wait, real quick.
Smart.
Just to go back. I just want
Sharp.
to say that tit for tat thing. I was just saying that the tat thing, there is some underlying built into probably our.
I don't think. Oh, sorry. I just did you so dirty, Destiny. I don't think I've ever seen Jordan Peterson compliment anybody, let alone on the left. You're smart. You're sharp. Okay, guys. I will put the link in the chat if you want to go watch the whole thing, but I am going to go to bed. Like the video, comment, subscribe.